I'm concerned about the affordability for the UK of many of the plans going forward. We have to take lessons from what's happening in Greece and recognise that we can't spend our way out of our problems without actually making sure that what we spend on is thoroughly economic. And I believe that there are aspects of what we could do that have been overlooked or underemphasised, and that's what I really want to bring this morning. Let's go back to fundamentals, because we can sometimes get lost in the complexity. What's energy for? And there are really four main things that we use our energy for. The first is we improve our buildings. We can see in here because the lights are on, and that's because of the electricity. Secondly, with all due respect to Jeremy's clients, we make useful stuff. Thirdly, we heat buildings, and for that we generally use fuels rather than electricity. And lastly, we move people and stuff, and for that we also use fuels rather than electricity. The question is, how much will our electricity take over from what we use fuels for, and to what extent will fuels be manufacturing our electricity in the first place? The grid is terribly useful. For example, it delivers roughly to each household and its equivalent jobs that go with each household about the energy equivalent of 2 tonnes of natural gas or 6 tonnes of coal each year. And it does so using no more than a fixed investment of about 50 kilograms of conductor cable plus a bit of steel to hold the cable up and a bit of insulation in the last few kilometres. However, there are worries, and there are lots of worries, but they really come in three categories. The first is that the grid is astonishingly wasteful in the sense that 50 to 70% of the energy, the fuel energy that goes in, is wasted. And with our network of large remote power plants, which were built that way because of their efficiency, it's not possible to use them realistically for combined heat and power. And anyway, in this country, we don't have the cold winters that, say, Scandinavia has, so there's never really been a strong argument for combined heat and power. Secondly, grid failure, as Ted Heath discovered, was much more costly than grid expansion. And that perversely makes demand reduction very difficult. You have a few generators, millions and millions of consuming devices. Getting the power back down again is a tough call. And thirdly, generation systems of all types put life, property and biosphere at risk. Life is put at risk if, for example, your renewable energy system fails to keep the lights on. Your coal-fired power plants are effectively putting the entire biosphere to some degree of risk. And lastly, but for a fortunate wind direction, Fukushima would have resulted in probably the biggest public health catastrophe in the world's largest capital city. So we need a better grid, and we need it soon. What are the elements that we're really looking for? We need much greater fuel efficiency. Whether that comes about by renewable generation or by other means is secondary. What we have to have is greater fuel efficiency, both for economic reasons as well as for carbon reasons. Secondly, we need a mechanism, ideally a price-driven mechanism, for controlling demand. We can't go on willy-nilly expanding supply in order to keep the lights on. There has to be an incentive to deal with the more difficult problem of figuring out why we use the energy we do. Then we need to reduce the risk of our generation systems. It is no longer acceptable for any of the generation industries to hide behind the fact that it is difficult to bring them to book when they drop the ball. So we need generation systems which remove the supply risks, low mineral resource consumption, whether that mineral is a petroleum or whether that mineral is a critical metal. Secondly, we need low net carbon emissions, obviously. Thirdly, we need low radiological contamination. And of course, I'm not talking about the normal run-of-the-mill, I'm talking about accidents, etc. And lastly, we need high reliability of generation on demand. And the danger with renewables is that we increase that risk enormously and result that we've and with the result we have no net benefit. And lastly, it would be very helpful if the grid was far less vulnerable to attack. So, the question we have to ask ourselves also is, can the grid do more? We would like the grid to be heating our buildings, either with CHP or with heat pumps. The problem with both of those at the moment is that the efficiency gains are rather modest. We would like our grid to take over the job that we currently leave to oil. We'd like it to move people and stuff. For cars and trucks and obviously trains, that's quite probable. Ships and planes, no. So, let's start by asking, where does our energy come from at the moment? And I want to simplify the discussion, so we're not going to have large spaghetti diagrams. We're just going to try and keep it simple. For every household in the country, including what their equivalent spend in the world of work as well as at home, they use about 4 kilowatts of oil, about 4 kilowatts of natural gas, about 1.5 kilowatts of coal, a little bit of nuclear, far less renewables. Most of that either goes to heat, which one can argue is a form of waste simply because we didn't insulate our buildings properly in the first place, or it goes to make some stuff, but most of it is wasted. The net result of that is about 800 watts of power that runs our transport. These are average figures, of course. 800 watts of gas power to contribute to the grid, another 400 watts from coal, another 300 watts from electricity, and a terribly small amount from everything else at the moment. So, what are the elements of a better grid? And now we come to the heart of it. I believe the key is to sort out the heat problem. As a result of a piece of work that we did in the solar field, we suddenly realized that this read across into the UK situation. That is seasonal geothermal heat storage. Quite practical, turns out to be quite cheap, but you have to do it fairly locally, on a scale of about 1,000 to 10,000, maybe 100,000 homes. We need local power plants, CCGT power plants, to feed heat into that geothermal storage in the summer, as well as the winter, of course, so that all of that heat is available to run district heating. The cost of district heating, implementing it nowadays, is actually cheaper than it was because of advances in materials. It needs to be natural gas fueled with an option to fire with liquid biofuels so that there is less supply risk. Coupled with seasonal natural gas storage, that should reduce the supply risk further. So when Russia decides to have another spat with the Ukraine, we're not left in the dark and the cold. And lastly, it needs to have a capacity such that it can electrify transport, but that transport will have to run rather slower and rather lighter to be affordable. Alongside that, we will need demand management, and that demand management not only has a control aspect to it, but also we need to further improve our building stock, lowering the thermal mass of the buildings as well as insulating them, because most residences are not heated continuously, and that fact is not reflected in the current building codes. We need to eliminate silly appliances like storage heaters. We need to include within the smart grid aspect what I call congestion charge pricing. And lastly, we need appropriate taxation on energy consumption so that it always features in people's thinking. So what does the resultant fuel profile look like? Our rather simplistic study suggests that we're going to approximately halve or more the amount of fuel that we use in order to generate a little more electricity than we currently consume. There is an expanded role from renewables, as per the current plans, but not excessively so. Nuclear, we've taken the assumption that it will not expand, but neither will it contract. All of the other fuel uses go down, but their outputs remain roughly the same. And you can flex how much natural gas, how much CCS, how much oil, or how much bioliquids you put in there according to market situations. The effect of this is it reduces the spark gap, the price between the difference between the cost of electricity and the cost of fuel. And that means that unused wind, and there will be more and more unused wind, can now be more economically stored, assisting grid balancing. It can be stored electrochemically, it can be stored thermally. My preference is thermal. The same heat is roughly available as before. There has been some improvement in the model in the amount that we put into the amount of insulation in our buildings, but not excessively so. But the result is large fuel savings. We need a UK-based supply chain that encompasses what's needed for seasonal geothermal storage. The technology exists. What's needed to implement a district heating system, and for economy, that will be a plastic-based, not a metal-based system. Obviously, we are going to electrify transport. We have to find a way of having a share of the battery market. And it seems a big hole in our industrial infrastructure at the moment that we don't. We should think about electrifying our motorways and trunk roads for our heavy vehicles, because that's the most efficient way to do it. We obviously need to upgrade the metering, the subject of yesterday's conference, and we need an installation rollout that's going to have to be backed by legislation as well as by market pressures. But the overall benefits are major. 60% reduction in fuel use, much lower net carbon emissions, no expansion in nuclear, sorry, but I regard that as a benefit, a multi-fuel capability to reduce our fuel supply risk. It uses gas turbine technology that is responsive and which, hey, we make. Thank you, Rolls-Royce. It's cheap to add the capacity. The capital cost per kilowatt of this is potentially nearly an order of magnitude less than some of the schemes being proposed. It places our critical generation close to the centres of consumption, which makes the grid less vulnerable, and ultimately gives us a pathway to biofuel substitution for the fuel that we do use a few decades down the road, but one can see cellulosic biofuel liquids making good progress. And in the future, the long future, which is where we came into as a company looking at this, concentrating solar, seasonal storage, greatly improves the long-term reliability. It would allow, for example, India to generate its electricity and get through the difficult monsoon period. Combined with a supergrid, and now we really are talking into the far future, it could eventually eliminate fossil fuel use entirely, as well as allow us to expand a global energy infrastructure. So we're a clean energy consultancy, but the reason for giving this talk is really to try and develop a coalition of the willing, to see whether there's a community of interested parties willing to promote this concept and to bring it to fruition. So please contact me. Thank you very much.